Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Montoya. Alright, in today's tutorial I'm going to be showing you how I made this fully lined cropped Kente hoodie hacking McCall's pattern M7688. Now this is a faster paced tutorial. It is geared towards advanced beginners slash intermediate sewists who already have experience working with patterns. So yeah, let's go ahead and jump right into the materials that you are going to need. To create my hoodie, I used McCall's M7688 as my base pattern, and I used 2 yards of this Kente print fabric. It is 100% cotton, and I also used some cozy flannel fabric for the lining. So this pattern is made for moderate stretch knits, but I am using woven fabric. So in order to choose my size, I went down to the finished garment measurements and looked at the finished bust line. And if I was using a knit, I would have cut the small. My bust is 35 inches. So I went ahead and cut the large just to give me about 11 inches or so of ease. All right, so the pattern pieces that I cut out were number 1, number 2, number 8, number 10, and 13. Oh, and I also cut out 14. For the lining, I cut out pattern pieces 1, 2, 8, and 10 only. Alright, so let's talk modifications. For the front pattern piece and for the back pattern piece, I went ahead and found the waistline measurement, and then I drew a line so that I could shorten the pattern. For my sleeve band, I went ahead and took out 1 inch because I do have very small wrists. So I just drew a line and then I'm going to fold this under. Alright, next is my hood modification. So don't mind all of these lines. I was trying to figure all this out. I did make a buttonhole marking, and this is the black one is my final one that I used. So from the bottom up to the top, I measured 3 inches, and then I measured over 1 5/8 of an inch, and then this buttonhole is 1/2 an inch. When I cut out the hood pattern piece in the lining, I found where it said the fold line, and before I cut out my fabric, I folded it back on the fold line, and then I proceeded to cut my lining piece. To make my drawstring, I went ahead and cut 2 pieces that measured 30 inches by 1.5 inches. Attach the front to back at both of the shoulders. I pressed my seam allowances open. Next, grab your sleeve and then go ahead and do 2 rows of gathering stitches down at the bottom. Grab your cuff, and with the wrong sides facing, fold it in half and go ahead and press. Then open it back up and choose one of the long edges. You're going to hem that 5/8 of an inch. I just used an index card to hem this. Alright, I went ahead and took my cuff, and now I have the right side of the cuff facing the right side of the sleeve. And where those notches were in the center, I went ahead and pinned those pieces together. And now I'm going to gather my sleeve until it is even with my cuff, and then I'm going to make sure that my gathers are even on both sides, and then stitch this down in place. And using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance for everything. And make sure that you pin the opposite side of the edge that's hemmed. So remember, we hemmed one edge 5/8 of an inch. You're working on the opposite side to pin it to the sleeve. Alright, once it's attached, you want to trim the seam allowance. And I just trimmed down the cuff seam allowance to about 1/4 of an inch. And then the rest, which is the sleeve seam, I just went ahead and pressed that down going towards the cuff. Now it's time to attach your sleeve to the top, and you're doing a flat sleeve method. When attaching your sleeve, make sure you do the first row of stitches at 5/8 of an inch, and then I went ahead and did my second row at 1/2 inch, and then I trimmed my seam allowance down close to the 1/2 inch stitch line, and then I pressed the seam allowance going towards the sleeve. Alright, you're going to finish up the flat sleeve method, and down here at the cuff, remember this was hemmed 5/8 of an inch. Just go ahead and flatten that out for now to sew this down, and then after we're done, we'll just roll it back up for our next step. Alright, the next thing you want to do is clip the curve, and so in the armhole area, I made a snip here and here. The next thing that I did was trim down the seam allowance. So I did a layer. I layered the seam when I cut it down. So for I think the back seam allowance, I cut it down to 1/4 of an inch, and then the other one I cut it down to 3/8. Then I pressed that seam flat, and then I turned it to the right side out and pressed it flat again. And depending on what fabric you use, you might need to use a pressing cloth. Now it's time to roll our sleeve back up. So we should have a pressing mark for that 5/8 of an inch. So I'm going to roll that up. And then we should have another seam mark that we pressed up that was halfway through. So I'm going to roll that up again. Sew your lining fabric the same exact way. The only thing different is you will not be attaching a cuff. On the sleeve lining piece, you are going to do something a little bit different. So down at the bottom, you want to do an E-stitch at the lower edge, but you don't want to take it all the way to the ends because you don't want it to be in the seam allowance, because later on we will need to ease this sleeve into our main fabric. Next thing you want to do is take the lining and your main fabric, and you want to put them with the wrong sides together. So right now I'm looking at the right side of the lining, and on the most inner part is the right side of the main fabric. So slip it through everything. So even slip the lining on the sleeve on both sides, and then the next thing you want to do is pin along the neckline and baste, and then also along the lower hem you want to pin and baste the lining and the main fabric together. On the lower edge you want to do 2 rows of gathering stitches. So when we attach the hem band later on, you'll be ready. Alright, to finish off the sleeve, remember that ease stitch that we made along the lining of the sleeve? You want to begin pulling that ease stitch until it will now fit inside of your main fabric. Alright, and once that raw edge is nice and inside of the cuff, you can go ahead and slip stitch around the cuff to hold that in place. Next, I'm going to sew my buttonholes on the right side of the hood. Now I'm going to stitch the center back pieces of my hood for my main fabric and also for my lining. For my hood, I clipped the curve on both the main fabric and also the lining fabric. To press that seam, I just turned it to the right side facing out, and just rolled that seam and then pressed along the edge. Next, I did the front edge of the hood. So in order to do that, what I did was first I folded under 1/4 of an inch, and then I folded under 1 inch. And yeah. Next, I'm putting my lining and my main fabric with the wrong sides facing each other, and I'm taking the edge of the lining and lining it up with the edge, that fold line that we made for the main fabric. Remember that 1 inch fold line? So the edge of my lining is lined up with that. I'm going to do that all the way around, and once I line it up, I am pinning on the outside because once we fold this over, you won't be able to access those pins if you put them on the inside. Alright, once you have the lining all pinned, you can now fold the main fabric covering the lining now, and then you can remove that pin and then pin through all layers. Next, I'm going to top stitch using a 7/8 of an inch seam allowance, or you can first start off on the inside, basting close to the edge, and then do a top stitch. Press that front edge once you're done stitching, and then do a basting stitch around the lower edge to connect the lining and the main fabric together. Now it's time to attach the hood to the top. So I did make an extra snip at the center back of the top so that I could line it up with the center back of the hood, and then make sure that you match up your notches, and this is where you're going to overlap the hood as well. Now I'm finishing off my neckline. So what I did was press the seam allowance going towards the bodice piece, and then I went ahead and trimmed the 3 layers of seam allowance underneath. I went ahead and trimmed those down to a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and then now I'm going to stitch close to the edge all the way around the neckline. Actually, no. Next, I'm going to stitch a 3/8 of an inch seam around the neckline to stitch the seam allowance down, and then I'm going to cut close to the stitching line. For trimming down this seam allowance, the best thing that I find for myself is to pinch it and cut just like this so that I can get as close to that stitching line as possible. For the hemband, I stitched on both of the short ends, and then next I created a fold line by folding it in half, and that created a a fold line that we'll be using later. And then I chose one of the long edges, it doesn't matter which one. I created another fold line, and I what is this measurement? 1/2 inch. So I used my index card and created a 1/2 inch fold line that we will also be using later. To connect the hemband, what you want to do is first pin at the side seams, and then I have a center notch in the hemband and also at the bottom hem of the bodice to line those up together. And then I'm going to pull those gathering stitches and then distribute my gathers evenly on both sides, and then also repeat that on the back, and then stitch around using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And then I'm going to press, I'll be back. Next, press that seam allowance going towards the hemband. Then on the hemband, remember that fold line, that 1/2 inch fold line we made, make sure that is turned up. And now fold on the other halfway fold line all the way around. And then now on the right side, we're going to stitch in the ditch to catch this piece to close it up. Alright, for the drawstring, I stitched it down at one end, and then on the other end I hemmed the edges. This is maybe about 3/8 of an inch, and I just pressed that down, and then now I'm going to fold it in half with the right sides together, and then I'm going to stitch it down using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I'm putting this end, the folded edge, to the 1/2 inch seam allowance mark to stitch it down. I turned my drawstring to the right side facing out, and on one end, and I gave it a nice press. On one end I put a safety pin, and now I'm going to feed it through the buttonhole and then make my way to the other side and even it all out.